let's jump in. So we're continuing on in our series called No Other Gospel, just walking through the book of Galatians. And um, this has been a long series, but I think it's been good. We've been spending a couple of weeks on each chapter of Galatians. There's 2 chapters left, so it will likely be about 4 weeks left in this series. We might be able to condense the last chapter because if you read any letters of Paul, if you're familiar with letters of Paul, they kind of all end the same way, which is just like him like signing off, and he's kind of long-winded. I can relate when it comes to signing off, and so we'll see how it all plays out. But just plan on being in the book of Galatians for a few more weeks at least. Um, this week we will be in Galatians 4 verses 8 through 20, so kind of a big chunk here. Um, but really, like the title of today's sermon is Anatomy of an Idol. Now, when we start talking about idolatry, I think the first thing that we need the kind of the thing that we need to preface ourselves with, preface our hearts with here, is that idolatry is sneaky. Idolatry is sneaky. Now, a simple definition of idolatry is just worshiping something other than God. When it comes to the idea of worship, like there's a lot of like work to do to figure out like what is worship, what is the difference between like worship and just liking something, what is the difference between worship and just like valuing something. Like we have a lot of like internal work to do when it comes to identifying idolatry in our lives. But the thing that we need to know is that idolatry is sneaky. Idols often come in unexpected forms, and this is why idolatry can be so sneaky, is because idolatry is not just the worship of other gods, right? We're not talking about just like Zeus, like, who in here struggles with occasionally worshiping Zeus? That's not what we're talking about when we talk about idolatry. It's not just other named gods. It's actually, it can come in unexpected forms, and sometimes the form of things that seem good. Sometimes idolatry can come in the form of things that seem good. We can make idols out of things that aren't necessarily bad things. But when we worship them, when we cross the line between just liking something or even loving something or valuing something to actually worshiping that thing, that's when it becomes idolatry. And so we'll see in this conversation, starting in verse 8, where, Paul has been talking, as we've said before, like he's pretty repetitive in this thing. He's talking about this one thing. He's talking a lot about the law, the Old Testament law, and he's really like hounding on this concept of the law versus grace. And we begin to see like he switches this argument, he switches the argument that he's making to the idea that the law has actually become something for people that they no longer just think is a good thing, but they actually have put in place of God himself. So let's see what he has to say. Verse 8 is where we will start. We'll read verses 8 through 11 to start off with. Formerly, when you did not know God, you were slaves to those who by nature are not gods. But now that you know God, or rather are known by God, how is it that you are turning back to those weak and miserable forces? Do you wish to be enslaved by them all over again? You are observing special days and months and seasons and years. I fear for you that somehow I have wasted my efforts on you. So, pretty harsh there at the end, right? I fear for you that somehow I have wasted my efforts on you. Now, we need to kind of reiterate who his audience is here. His audience in this particular letter, he's writing to a church who is mostly comprised of people who were not Jewish who converted to Christianity. So they were Gentiles who converted to Christianity. Now, in that region, Gentiles were essentially The best way to group them in terms of like spirituality is they were pagans. And essentially what that means, like paganism in that time was not a specific religion. It was actually just considered like the worship of any other gods. And now, like there were a ton of gods that were worshiped in that time. There were different temples that were designated to all sorts of different gods. When we think of like the region of like Greece and like the larger region of Rome, which took over Greece, like generally we think of like the Greek and Roman gods. And we think of all these things that we can name, as I already mentioned, Zeus. Like most of you went through this mythology like section in school at some point where you learned all the names of all the Greek and Roman gods. And so often like we think of just those. Like those are probably the gods that these people worship. And yeah, to some extent, it was those gods. But the thing about those types of religions is there wasn't necessarily idolatry in those religions. You could worship Zeus, and you could also worship Dionysus. You could worship Zeus, and you could also worship just some random god that somebody, came up with and said, yeah, this is the god of whatever. So there wasn't necessarily idolatry in that culture. They could worship whatever group of gods they wanted to worship. And so when Paul is confronting this, the first thing that he says is, formerly when you did not know God, you were slaves to those who by nature are not gods. So what he's saying is like, hey, you've worshiped all sorts of stuff in your life. You've worshiped the sun. You've worshiped the moon. You've worshiped, the land. You've worshiped like these images, these like statues. You've worshiped all sorts of things, and those things were not gods. They were just images. And formerly, when you did not know God, you were a slave to all of those things. Like what he's saying to them is like, if you like have ever dug into any of like how people worshiped all of these other gods, there was a lot of ritual involved. Like a lot of ritual. There were specific temples designated to specific gods, and if you worshiped more than one, you had to give all of these things and all of these practices to all of these different temples, and you just had a lot to do. There was a lot of ritual involved in it. And what Paul was saying is like, hey, when you worshiped all those other gods, like you were a slave to all of those rituals. Like those things dictated your life. He says, but now that you know God, or rather are known by God, how is it that you are turning back to those weak and miserable forces? What he's talking about here is he's talking about the difference between freedom in Christ and captivity to idols. Freedom in Christ versus captivity to idols. Now, it's a little confusing here because what it sounds like Paul is saying is it sounds like Paul is accusing this group of people of going back to worshiping those gods that they used to worship. But he's never brought this up before. The problem before has been not that they're going to worship other gods, but they're turning back to the law. Like they're turning back to these Jewish Christians who have come in and said like, hey, now that you're converting to Christianity, we need you to go back and actually follow the law. We need you to actually become Jewish first, and then you can become Christian. And so that's what Paul has been talking about the whole time. But now it sounds like he's saying, you're going back to worshiping all these other gods. So what exactly is going on here? Here's the thing, is that the forces behind false gods are the same forces that tell you that grace isn't enough to get you to God. The same forces behind these false idols, these literal other gods that are statues that people have worshiped, those same forces are the same ones that are coming in and telling the Gentiles, hey, you got to become Jewish first. You got to follow the law first. The force behind that says God's grace poured out in Jesus Christ is not enough. Those same forces are the same ones behind all of the false idols that they used to worship. What it's telling us here, what Paul is saying to the Gentiles in this portion, is he's saying Idolatry is sneaky. Idolatry is sneaky. He's accusing the Gentiles of actually listening to people who are trying to turn the law into God. But God is not the law, and God is not bound by the law. God is full of freedom and grace and all of the things that Christ came to set people free from. I assume a lot of you in here are familiar with the concept of Stockholm Syndrome, right? Is this a familiar thing to a lot of you, Stockholm Syndrome? Stockholm Syndrome is essentially like when you begin to defend your captors. It started in terms of like war. It started like in times of war when people were like prisoners of war. And they began to they were in prison so long that they began to actually see the people who captured them and are holding them captive as actually like good. And the reason that they began to see them as good and they began to actually like love them, and not like enemy love like Jesus says that we should have, but actually like defend them from people. The reason that this began to happen is because the only care that these captors received was from the people who captured them. Well, the way things work in war with prisoners of war is like you can't just treat them awfully. You still have to like provide them food. You still have to like take care of them, make sure they don't die. They might live in awful conditions, but you got to keep them alive. And so the captors who are keeping the prisoners alive began to be seen by the prisoners as their caretakers. And so they began to have this this situation where like even when they were set free, they were like, well, no, we want to be back in captivity because those people took care of us. You see the problem here, right? Our captors meet our basic needs. They treat us well. We'd be better off with them. It's a crazy thing to think of from the outside looking in, but it's a real thing that happens. It's called a syndrome for a reason. It's like a physical and emotional and mental thing that begins to happen to people who are in captivity. It's a pretty good like analogy and explanation of how idolatry can happen in our lives. We begin to think that something that is lesser than God is actually the thing that is taking care of us. And then we begin to give our love and our devotion to that thing rather than to God. And so this thing that Paul is pointing out in the Gentiles is like, hey, listen, you guys have been given, you've experienced the love and grace and freedom that God has to offer. Why are you trying to go back to your captors? Why are you trying to go back to the thing that enslaved you? It might seem easier, but it's not. Not even close. It actually is the opposite of freedom. What happens often is we turn good into God. We turn good into God. We turn good enough into great. We get used to doing things and practicing things in such a way that like, yeah, this gets me by. I've gotten so conditioned to this. When it starts to feel as though these other things that aren't inherently bad are giving us the feelings that we want more efficiently than God does, it's easy to elevate those things into his place. Does that make sense? As you start to like practice things in such a way where you begin to rely on things other than God to get you the feelings that you're looking for, or even like the things that you want out of life, whether it's success or health or I don't know, you name it, the things that you value, the things that you chase after. Have you experienced times in your life where you've chased after these things and you've realized that sometimes the way to get those things more efficiently and more conveniently and a little bit faster and easier is actually to go through means that might even be contrary to God? You're looking for a promotion at work. Isn't it sometimes easier to maybe push somebody else down rather than to do the things that will lift you up to get that? Sometimes that's the easier way. And sometimes it's not inherently bad in the sense that maybe that person actually doesn't deserve it. Like maybe that person, maybe they're using ulterior means that don't line up with it. And so you justify it in your heart by saying, well, they're bad, like they don't deserve it. And so then you just take it a little further by just like pushing them down more rather than actually just going about your business, doing things the right way in hopes that that is the way to get what you want. You know, that's kind of a, off-the-cuff, vague example. But I think that we can all maybe think of things in our lives that we've treated in that way, where we've actually used means that don't line up with the gospel to get the things that we want because maybe they bring it a little faster. Guys, the truth is, sometimes the way of the kingdom isn't efficient. Let's look at an example actually from the scriptures. When I hear of this idea of like Stockholm syndrome as it relates to the people of God, like our captors meet our basic needs, they treat us well, we'd be better off with them. This echoes very, very strongly of the Exodus. So let's look at an example in the book of Exodus, where the Israelites actually experienced this exact same thing. If you know the story of the Exodus, the Israelites were held captive in Egypt for like literally generations. Like Israelites grew up as slaves in Egypt and experienced their whole life in slavery in Egypt to the Egyptians. And God rose up a guy named Moses and said, like, hey, you're going to actually free the people of God. You're going to free my people from from Egyptian captivity. And then, that happened, and then they actually found themselves away from the comforts that they experienced in Egypt. Comforts just being like food, like food and a place to sleep. They found themselves away from that and actually like wandering in the desert, like a whole nation of people wandering in the desert for 40 years. And they naturally began to get a little antsy at times. And so in Exodus 14, starting in verse 11, they actually accuse Moses. They start complaining to Moses. They said to Moses, "Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us to the desert to die? What have you done to us by bringing us out of Egypt? Didn't we say to you in Egypt, 'Leave us alone. Let us serve the Egyptians'? It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the desert. It would have been better for us to be enslaved than to be free." That's what they are saying to Moses. That's what the people of God are saying to Moses. We were better off enslaved than free. Perfect example of Stockholm syndrome. Like, let us go back to our captors. Let us go back to our slave drivers. Let us go back to the ones who actually, they were awful, but at least they fed us. At least they kept us comfortable. This is the thing that Paul is consistently bringing the Galatians back to. He's saying, hey, I know you're not Jewish. Like, you might not know this story very well, but there was a time when the Jewish people faced this exact same thing that you are facing now. They faced the option to have freedom that God provided for them or to go back into slavery. And they wanted, with everything in them, to go back to their captors, to go back into captivity. You are doing the same thing now. You are looking for something other than the freedom that God has given you, and you're searching after those things instead of God. And he ends that section by saying, I fear for you that I somehow have wasted my efforts on you. Now, there's one thing that we kind of scraped over here that I want to go back to, because I think this is a really important thing for us to there's a really important sidebar. In verse 9, he says, but now that you know God, or rather are known by God, how is it that you're returning back to those weak and miserable forces? It's kind of interesting that he does this here, right? Like, he's like, it's not like he's just speaking off the cuff. He's writing. Like, he could scrap things. He could be like, I know that I wrote this, but no, like, scrap that. Let's skip. I know that I said, now that you know God, but I want to scrap that and rewrite it and say, now that you are known by God. But he leaves that in. And I think what he's doing is important here. I think what he's designating the difference between knowing God and being known by God. Both of these things are important. It's important to know God. It's important to be known by God. But it's also important to understand the difference. It is so hard for our finite minds to comprehend God. Has anyone struggled with this? Has anyone struggled with just the concept of what it means to understand God? But to think that he knows us inside and out and loves us anyway, that's the good stuff. To know that we don't have to have pressure to know him inside and out, to know everything about him, to be able to put him into words, to be able to take the infinite and make it finite and understandable. We don't have the pressure of having to do that because we know that the creator of the universe knows us. And somehow that should be enough, because what comes along with that is that he knows everything about us. He knows the things within us that want to search for things other than him. He knows the things within us that want to be like, whatever, God, like you're good and all, but this thing will get me what I want faster. This thing will get me what I want. He knows that about you. He knows those thoughts that you've had, and he loves you anyway. And he chases after you anyway. And he blesses you anyway. It's a covenant relationship. Paul's pointing back to what he's been talking about the whole time, that God made a promise and he's going and has fulfilled that promise. You don't have to go back. He's fulfilled the promise, and we are in a covenant relationship with him. It's not transactional, but relational. It's not, you do this for me because I have the power and I said so. That's not how God works. Instead, it's you do X and I do Y because we are in this together, and that's how we come to know and love one another. And sometimes I'll do X and you do Y. That's how relationships work, right? It's not just you do this every time and then I'll do this. Sometimes we have some rules in our house, right? Some like ways of splitting up the workload at home. I do dishes and laundry sometimes, right? It's not just like, oh, Gloria does that and I do the yard work. Like, no. Well, I do the yard work, but we might need to split that one up a little better. But anyway. But like, it's like, yeah, hey, this time you do the dishes, I'll do the yard work. Maybe sometimes I'll do the dishes, you do the yard work, right? That's a silly way to look at it, but this is how relationships work. Is it's give and take. And the covenant relationship that God wants with people is the same way. It's not, hey, here's the law, just do it. You follow this, you do your part, and that's what you're created for. You just do this. And don't worry about why. Don't ask questions. Don't have doubts. Just do it. I have the power. I'm God. He could be that way. He has every right to be that way, but he's not. Because he desires a covenant relationship with people where it's actually give and take. And then, Paul has this weird part in here where he mentions, these observing special days and months and seasons and all this kind of stuff. Now, this part gets a little weird because, a lot of people do a lot of weird things with this. There's some kind of offshoots of Christianity that are like, oh, well, see this? We can't observe special days and months, no birthdays, no holidays, none of that stuff, because Paul said not to. That's not what he's saying. What he's actually saying is, the special days that he's speaking of are the Jewish festivals. And those Jewish festivals, what they were for was they were looking forward, they were pointing forward to the fact that God would eventually fulfill their promise to him. What has happened here? God has already fulfilled his promise. And Paul is saying, you're still observing these special days, these specific days and months and seasons that are looking forward to the promise of God that has actually already been fulfilled. You're going back. You're going back to the law. You're going back to having to go through a different route to get to Jesus when Jesus has made the way. Don't go back. All right, let's kind of zip through this last part. So verses 12 through 20, I'm just going to read this whole thing. I plead with you, brothers and sisters, become like me, for I became like you. You did me no wrong. As you know, it was because of an illness that I first preached the gospel to you. And even though my illness was a trial to you, you did not treat me with contempt or scorn. Instead, you welcomed me as if I were an angel of God, as if I were Christ Jesus himself. Where then is your blessing of me now? I can testify that if you could have done so, you would have torn out your eyes and given them to me. How have I now become your enemy by telling you the truth? Now, Paul's been most of his arguments in this letter have been really, really heavily theological, right? He's going back and he's digging into their beliefs and their theology and all this stuff. Been really heavy on theology. Now all of a sudden he switches to relationship. He switches to this place where he's like, hey, do you remember when I first came to you? Do you remember the times that we had, the way that I actually arrived at you? I was sick. I was in a really bad place, and you took me in and you cared for me. You treated me as if I were Christ himself. You treated me so well. And we had these times together, and you listened to the gospel, and you believed it. And now, what has happened? Why are you now going back on all this? Don't you remember? And then he says in 17, these people are zealous to win you over, but for no good. What they want is to alienate you from us so that you may have zeal for them. It is fine to be zealous, provided that the purpose is good, and to be so always, not just when I am with you. My dear children, for whom I am again in the pains of childbirth until Christ is formed in you, how I wish I could be with you now and change my tone because I am perplexed about you. So he's bringing up again these people who are coming in and saying, no, you got to do this, you got to do this, you got to do this. And he's saying hey, I know they're zealous. I know they're passionate. But just because something is said with passion doesn't mean it's true. Just because something is said with zeal and passion doesn't mean it's true. Man, does our culture need to hear that. We've gotten to this place where the louder and angrier and more passionate somebody says something, the more it's taken seriously. And Paul essentially says, like, hey, if it's passion you want, all right, here it is. And he goes into it a little bit. Like it's not like bad. He's like, hey, it's not wrong to be passionate and zealous about things that are good. It's not wrong. But he's like, if you're going to do it, like, do it. Don't just back off because these other people are coming in and saying, like, no, it's this, it's this, it's this. Don't all of a sudden give up the passion you have. He's speaking about integrity. He's speaking about actually putting into practice the things you say loudly. Again, another thing our culture needs to hear. If you're going to say it loud, then actually do it. How many times do you see people saying things loud, shouting things from the rooftop, and then it comes out they weren't practicing that at all. They were actually doing the opposite of that in their private life. All right, I want to sum this all up in this way. We're talking about this idea of idolatry. We're talking about this idea of putting even things that can be good, elevating them to God level. So I want to say this. God has acted, and we've experienced his infinite grace and goodness. We've been given the ability to know him and to be known by him, the Father, the Son, and the Spirit. To go back, to choose anything else, is to deny God himself. Those of you who would call yourselves followers of Jesus, you follow Jesus because you have experienced his goodness and his grace. You've experienced the love of God poured out in the good news of Jesus. If you've experienced that, just know there is nothing better. There is no better way. There is no other thing in this world that can give you that kind of fulfillment. There might be things that are more efficient. There might be a faster way to get the feelings that you want, but that will fade. What won't fade is the goodness and grace and love of God poured out in Christ Jesus. Bobby's going to come up and lead us into communion, and then we're going to sing some more.